This week on the agenda, saving the planet. What's really at stake at the COP16 Biodiversity Summit in Colombia? And who's going to pay the bill? With the COP16 Biodiversity Summit taking place in Cali, Colombia, conservationists and government delegations will talk about how to limit and cope with the impacts of climate change on nature and who's going to pay for it. Developing nations like China feel they shouldn't have to pay for the industrialized world's failures. 2 years ago, 196 countries supported a global biodiversity framework, pledging to halt nature loss by the end of the decade. But are those commitments looking endangered? Joining me now are Thomas Crowther, Professor of Ecology at ETH Zurich, Lin Li, Senior Director of Global Policy and Advocacy at the World Wildlife Fund, Dimitri, Regional Director of Programs for Asia at ClientEarth, and Akanksha, Khatri, Head of Nature and Biodiversity for the World Economic Forum. Thank you all of you for coming on the agenda. Thomas, let's start with you. What would you say are the main drivers of biodiversity loss, and how are they being addressed?
So obviously our society is built to value certain parts of nature over others, and that has led to economic and financial systems that have oversimplified nature. But now we're left with a situation where there's one key driver underpinning the entirety of our global biodiversity threat, and that is actually the inequitable distribution of wealth on our planet. So the challenge with our global biodiversity movement is finding and empowering the billions of local farmers, indigenous populations, the local communities who are the stewards of nature across the globe, and distributing. We need our political and financial mechanisms to distribute the flow of energy and wealth towards those people so that they can find the sustainable and regenerative options that will help all of us.
So, Dimitri, why do you think that now that this is a crucial moment for policymakers to address biodiversity loss and climate change? You know, how's it all intertwined?
Well, just a few years ago, the Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed in Montreal under the presidency of China, and so that really gave a big new boost to the whole world for what to do about biodiversity. It sets very clear targets. But it takes a bit of time for all the countries around the world to actually follow up on that, make national plans, put it into their laws. A lot of this needs to happen still. The ocean, for example, is supposed to be 30% protected by 2030. Currently, the level of protection for the world's oceans is still very, very low. So an awful lot needs to happen, and I think all countries now really realize that. So it's definitely a key moment.
Akanksha, as Dimitri was just mentioning, COP15 in Montreal was really pivotal, putting biodiversity at the heart of the global agenda, at the heart of the conversation for businesses, for financial institutions. How would you say that the landscape has changed in the last 2 years?
I think sometimes we forget when we are faced with huge challenges like biodiversity loss, like inequity of society, how much progress has actually been made. So in December 2022, the countries agreed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Today, as we are gearing for COP16 in Colombia, more than 400 private organizations, companies, banks, insurers have signed up to assess and disclose their impact on nature. And that is something which did not exist before. They've
made those commitments. Everyone's talking about it. And Lin, while everyone's talking about it, and biodiversity loss has become part of the dominating conversation around the world, and those landmark pledges have been made. Not everyone's sticking to their word, are they? Countries, I mean.
Not really. We are facing the crisis that we never faced before, and our WWF's Living Planet report 2024 just launched says that we have lost 73% of the population size of the wildlife we tracked over the past 50 years. And this is showing the indication of the ecosystem that we rely on are in danger, are losing their ability to provide health and resilience for us. At the same time, as we all mentioned, the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed and the countries are required to implement them. And then there are some countries, 60 some countries, revised their targets. So we see a challenge that we need to tackle with a global effort. However, we see the country's effort has not up there yet. And we know there are many reasons for that, and there are political willingness, whether we have elevated the nature to the high enough level for the country to really address the challenge we have, or we have a capacity, for example, Global South, limitations that we need help from the North to help all the country working together. So this is a collective effort we all need to work on together, across government, across players, whole of government, whole of society, and human rights-based approach that we all need to work on to deliver.
Dimitri, why do you think that there's been this lack of progress on national biodiversity plans ahead of COP16?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there's obviously a whole lot of other things going on in the world today, and that's a bit concerning because, the biodiversity loss and issues like climate change or ocean pollution, they actually threaten all of humanity, and they also threaten to set back a lot of the development progress that has been made. And so a lot of these distractions, to me, certainly seem unfortunate. It would be much better if governments in all countries, developed countries and also developing countries, could get together and speak a lot more about how to step up action for biodiversity and to reverse the loss of biodiversity now in order to save us all and give a better future for our children.
It's interesting there, you're talking about partnerships, collaboration, maybe countries working more closely together, and perhaps something that we can pick up a little bit later on in the conversation. But Lynn, I wanted to come back to the WWF report that looked into country strategies and the progress that they've made, because you mentioned just a handful there, just a few countries who have actually submitted those national plans. And even those who have, it's all, it's a bit wishy-washy, isn't it? It's still quite a bit vague, low on detail, low on an actual plan. How's success going to be measured? How's it all going to be funded? So what needs to happen in Cali to change that?
So we saw an encouraging trend that countries are trying to step up their submission of MBSAPs. However, only MBSAPs is not enough, and we need to step up the implementation, the track of progress, and also the effort of our whole country put together. We'll continue to track that to go from 5 angles. We based on the MBSAP we need, we published earlier, to look at ambition, to look at the means of implementation, to look at the whole of government, whole of society approach, and to look at human rights-based approach, and also to look at the progress in tracking how do we increase the ambition over the time. So hopefully the effort like one organization like WWF does, and together with many other players, we call for government to really take their commitment to deliver. We call for other players, including what Akanksha mentioned, the business and the other players, civil societies, that we all together, because eventually we are all in this together. The science we have seen in nature, it's accumulating. Wildlife loss is one signal, but eventually the accumulated effort may be coming together into something forces unpredictable and potentially irreversible. We call a tipping point, that the nature can no longer provide the service they provide to us. To avoid that, MBSAP for the country to really deliver is only one aspect, and we need more. We need more the financial resources to protect our diversity, address drivers. At the same time, South and the North collaborating with the North supporting South to increase their capacity to take the challenge on their hand.
So Thomas, let's talk about the impetus for action. Because you know what, it's been a really big year for elections all around the world. And we've seen governments reforming, we've seen governments changing. And I wonder if that lack of continuity has hindered pushing these policies forward, or if on the other hand, you smell opportunity.
Humans are very good at addressing the threat that's directly in front of them and ignoring the long-term challenge that underpins those threats. We're tackling things like economic losses, like food insecurity, climate change, even wars, and yet we tend to avoid the massive underlying threats like biodiversity loss that ultimately underpin all of those things. If we focus only on our emergent threats and vote only dependent on our prominent concerns, we might build a world that can't sustain those decisions on into the future. But there are signs of real hope in all of this. Examples like Costa Rica, where their Payment for Ecosystem Service program distributed money to local farmers in order to compensate them from bringing back biodiversity. And what that did, it didn't only bring back the beauty of nature. We've had students recording the sounds of nature as it's recovering, becoming more diverse, more complex, more varied. But also it showed that at the same time, the economy improved. When nature did better, so it was built into the cultural identity of the people in Costa Rica. And so now all of the developing businesses, all of the developing enterprises have sustainability at their core. It's like part of their cultural identity. And through that process, ecotourism has improved, but so have those sustainable businesses. And the economy has absolutely boomed, proving that nature can be the economic preference at a national scale when you get that wealth distribution right.
And yet, green issues, biodiversity, climate, those things have tended to slip down the agenda come election time, when, as you mentioned, people are looking at those issues that are much more closer to home, much more in front of them. Akanksha, in terms about, let's talk about, where the impetus for change is going to come from, not just that call to action, but which countries. The EU, well, they used to be that champion, didn't they, of initiatives to protect nature, and I wonder how pressure from farmers and from the far right might be changing that.
I think you're absolutely right. 2024 has been the super year for elections. More than half of the world's population across 60 countries is going to polls this year. But that also is the atmosphere which makes it very ripe for misinformation and disinformation. And we should not appreciate the role of media and communication in how we talk about biodiversity. It doesn't have to be just an environmental issue, but an enabling condition for economic growth, job creation, and changing the cultural identity of people, to the point that Tom was raising earlier as well. So our research at the World Economic Forum shows that if we pivot to a nature-positive economy, we can actually create 395 million jobs and unlock $10.1 trillion of business opportunities. And that's extremely critical, because when you have challenges that come up where people start thinking about a 30 by 30 protection target as something which will take land away from agriculture or take land away from urban infrastructure. So I think it's really important that as we are preparing for COP16 in Colombia next week, we recognize that nature is the underpinning infrastructure. It is the asset class that we all need to invest in if our economy has to thrive, if we need jobs for future, and more importantly, if we need resilience against extreme weather patterns, as we are now seeing even in the US with the hurricane. So I hope that narrative shifts and we start thinking of nature as an asset and an ally, rather than just something that needs to be protected.
Let's pause there, but stay with us. There's still to come here on the agenda how financing global biodiversity protection may be the acid test for committed countries to turn their words into action.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to the agenda. And let's get more from our panel on global progress to protect biodiversity with Thomas Crowther, Professor of Ecology at ETH Zurich, Dimitri Regional Director of Programs for Asia at ClientEarth, Lin Li, Senior Director of Global Policy and Advocacy at the World Wildlife Fund, and Akanksha, Khatri, Head of Nature and Biodiversity for the World Economic Forum. We've been talking about how nature is an asset and an ally, and the cost of biodiversity loss. I mean, Thomas, I'm looking at some figures here from the UK's Green Finance Institute. They say damage to the natural environment is slowing the economy and could account for a 12% reduction in GDP in future years. That's if it's not addressed right now. I mean, that's larger than the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the global financial crisis. And I'm just talking about the UK. So how do you see the scale of the problem here?
You're exactly right. And I would add, there's other scientists who will say that's even an underestimate. That's quite a conservative estimate. The losses of the economic losses that will happen as a result of biodiversity loss far outweigh the costs of actually protecting biodiversity. So it's the easiest economic decision that our society has ever had to face. There's some basic, simple ideas underpinning this. If you were to think of agriculture as an example, if you're in a country that is totally covered in forest, you need to clear some forest in order to have room for agriculture. There is, at the beginning of land clearing, there is a positive impact on agricultural gains. But at the end, once you've cleared 99% of your forest, removing that last 1% is only going to deplete your agricultural production because you've destroyed the soil, you've destroyed climate regulation, you've got no pollinators, you can't grow food. And that means there's a tipping point in between. So as we clear forests, or as we clear nature, we start to get more agriculture and then we start to get less. And what we found is that 70% of the countries on our planet have already exceeded that tipping point. We've already reached a state where more removal of nature is depleting the agricultural yields in the farms that already exist. So there's this sort of idea in our society that nature comes at the expense of people, or we have to choose nature or agriculture, whereas in fact the science is crystal clear. We have to choose nature so that we can have agriculture. We cannot have a sustained economy without it. Everything
all of you is saying makes business sense, doesn't it? How we need to focus on biodiversity, how we need to protect the planet. But Lynn, the WWF report that you did with the Sustainable Finance Lab says that central banks and supervisors aren't giving that enough attention. They're not giving nature enough attention in their monetary policies, in their instruments. How would you like to see that being addressed in Colombia?
The subsidies that countries are putting in production, in agriculture, are at magnitude higher, 10 times higher than the funding that we put on conserve nature. And that means like it's like our house on fire. But we put fuel on the house 10 times more than we put water trying to put out a fire. And our system is like that way. So therefore, the finance system, if we don't transform multi-banks is one of them, our fiscal budgeting system, fiscal system, we need to really look at addressing the harmful subsidies. And that actually agreed the world as a target 18 of the Montreal Biodiversity Framework. The world need to address together. I think that's critical. If we don't address the finance system and we don't really transform the food system, the finance system, the energy system, we are not able to protect those we are already conserved. And then we are not going to be able to restore the ecosystems that can eventually provide stable services to us. So in a way, the financial sectors need to really step up their effort and then put their effort on together to deliver the GBF.
Akanksha, when it comes to bridging that finance gap and encouraging private as well as a public investment into protecting the planet, we've seen green bonds, biodiversity offsets, carbon credits. But what are the new innovations that we really needed for transformation to take place?
That's a really good question, because I think most of us on this panel and others who are going to Colombia will be talking about the biggest piece is who's going to finance the biodiversity framework, who's going to finance the targets that we have set ourselves for in the NBSAPs and other pieces. So it's not just a few financial products or mechanisms which are trying to bridge the financing gap, but fundamentally every dollar that is getting spent into our real economy is not harming nature, but they're actually moving nature positive outcomes forward. And those two pieces are extremely critical. In Colombia next week and the week after, there will be significant discussion on the role of private sector, both in terms of unlocking new sources of finance through instruments like blue bonds, green bonds, biodiversity credits, but also the role of banks, insurers, and asset managers to really look at the books and understand what is their exposure to nature loss today. What is their exposure to agriculture and land degradation today? And how can they start pivoting that money, which is a big chunk of money, towards activities, business opportunities, and new models, which will leave nature more regenerative than depleted?
So there's lots in the mix there. Talk about innovations, lots of financial instruments that might come into play, that there might be resolutions over. But let's talk again about the country-to-country approach. Dimitri, I wonder where China is at with this. It's one of the more proactive countries, having submitted its updated plans on tackling biodiversity loss and environmental degradation. They submitted that in January, and their overall goal is to build a beautiful China where humans and nature live in harmony by 2050. But is China ready for Biodiversity COP?
Well, I would say that there's definitely been an awful lot of progress in China in the last few years, and we witnessed it directly at ClientEarth. We've been closely cooperating with the Supreme Court in China, and also the Supreme People's Procuratorate, which is sort of a national prosecutor's office, and also the Ministry of Environment, and all of the efforts they've put into updating legislation, making good national biodiversity strategy plans, thinking really carefully about how to do the delineation of the 30% on land, and also looking at other benefits, like how does this provide more climate resilience? How does this provide more ecosystem services? It's not just about biodiversity. It's also about real economic benefits that you can measure. And all of these things have been done in a really scientific way in the past few years. A lot of issues like trade in illegal species and all of that have really been stepped up in a big way. And I think that reminds us all that the role of the law is really important here. You know, societies for 4,000 years have found ways to deal with problems, usually by making a law and then enforcing them properly so everybody actually follows them. And that then changes behavior. People get used to it. Businesses find other ways of doing business, you know, and society moves on. But the problem must be solved. And usually you need a law to do that. You can't just rely on everybody to try to do the right thing. You know, it's very important to have laws that set a baseline for what society must live up to. And in many ways, I think China has made tremendous strides in that regard with the specialized environmental courts and also special systems where prosecutors can go to court for the environment. A tree can't go to court. A fish can't go to court. If the air is polluted, the air cannot go to court. Somebody has to do that. And so having special systems and people who do that specifically is very, very important.
Let's talk about the role of law, though, in other parts of the world, Thomas. I mean, in Europe, there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. In Japan, there's the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. Is that really it?
Yeah, right now, the business case for nature is coming along, and there's a growing appreciation that, particularly in the finance industry, like the insurance world, and the people that are most dependent on nature, that business case is starting to come along very, very, very slowly. But it doesn't have the legal framework that really is incentivizing the scale and speed of change that we need. And I think that's often because we tackle problems that are in our immediate presence and forget the wider picture. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, I mean, you know, Lynn mentioned it earlier, if we don't talk about subsidies, it's going to be impossible to turn this tide. We're talking about 10 times more money going to things that destroy our planet than the things that help our planet. That has to be on the top of the docket. We also cannot be really progressing in these negotiations if we're not talking about addressing loss and damages, debt cancellation from the global north. We've got billions of dollars that could be redistributed to the global south to be able to protect and restore nature and bring back those economies that are dependent on nature. And so we really need that high level decision making if we're going to come close to having the sort of the bottom up movement that we need.
Well, Lynn Thomas there was talking about maybe writing off some of the loans from the global north. I mean, beyond more dialogue and more promises, how can wealthier nations support the more vulnerable?
So they agreed. They agreed by next year, actually 2025, the global north will put $20 billion to the global south to support their delivering the biodiversity conservation and addressing the drivers. And then by 2030, that amount should be increased to $30 billion per year. And this is just from the government aid point of view flow. But then we need, like Akanksha and Dimitri and Tom all mentioned, that we need financial source from all sources to put on nature, because nature is for all. And if without a home, without a fundamental system, we won't be prosperous economically or socially. Yeah. So the nature is underpin all, and the world need to put all the financial means, bring all the players to meet the financial gap. We know the biodiversity gap is huge because we take nature as granted.
Akanksha, what will make COP16 a success for you?
If governments really step up on all fronts. I think for me, the biggest piece is that we just don't have the time for voluntary action. We need clearer policy guidelines, directives, and rule of law, which puts nature at the very center of our economy and society. So this goes by addressing the subsidy reform piece, talking about natural capital valuation, as well as giving the directive to businesses to put nature-related reporting and disclosures to be mandatory.
Dimitri?
I would say, all countries definitely need to come with their national biodiversity strategies going into this, and then immediately following the COP, they should go home and put them into law, and then proceed with their implementation. Very important part of that is definitely the support from the developed countries to the global south. They really need that help, and the best biodiversity is still in the global south.
Lynn, what will make COP16 a success for you?
So I would say there are two fronts. One is in the negotiation room inside the COP16 negotiation plenary or contact groups, that we need countries to step up on their resource mobilization. We need countries to step up on their MBSAP development and implementation. We need them to step up on their mainstreaming and the synergy, and all this should be built on the human rights and based approach. Remember, the Minister of the Environment cannot address this challenge alone, and then countries need to really work together. However, I also look at another success, which is outside the negotiation room, but as a world to coming together, utilizing the COP16 as an opportunity to see how can we elevate nature, how can we really find a path working together to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. For example, our plastics is impact nature, and we are at the last final mile to get a plastic treaty to be agreed. So COP16, if the country agree in a way, we will walk steadily that last mile to really get a global treaty on plastics. That's also a success for the humanity.
And Thomas, the last word to you.
We also desperately need a consensus on how we measure nature. If we're going to be able to monitor and track progress and try to move things in the right direction, we have to know what it is we're dealing with. And there are thousands of different discussions and negotiations and challenges around doing that. But there are also tools out there that currently exist, like the Seed Biocomplexity Index, like Restore.eco, that can actually be used right now. They're ready to go for companies to collectively use to measure their footprint and track progress, hopefully in the right direction.
Thomas Crowther, Akanksha Khatri, Dimitri de Boer and Lynn Lee, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, Harris or Trump? What will the outcome of the upcoming US presidential vote mean for China and the rest of the world? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.